going through the book of Esther. So Esther is a beautiful book from the Old Testament, and this is our third week in it, wherein we are going through the beautiful story of how God can divinely reverse situations or even people on their certain stance. Why? For the purpose and plan of God to come into fruition. There is nothing more glorious than to see God's plan slowly happening and unfolding before our very eyes. And last week, we left off with chapter 3, where we were introduced to the kontrabida of the season, the protagonist. Diba? We all love to hate that character. And in this case, Haman was introduced to us, who, for some very good persuasion to the king, came up with a very, very bad news for the Jews. Okay. Haman, we all know, as introduced by Sister Nina last week, was the right-hand man of King Xerxes. And as such, the family line where Haman came from was the tribe of the Agagites. The Amalekites, and part of that are the Agagites. And this was the tribe that God wanted killed, destroyed, annihilated. But by some very good, obedient King Saul, who did not obey what God wanted him to do, he saved King Agag. And for that reason, Haman came into being. Had King Saul obeyed, there would not have been the Agagites, and Haman would not have existed at this point in time. You see how things just come out, if whether we obey or we do not obey, the story just changes. And by some divine sovereignty, God, in His wisdom and in His wondrous ways, would always just swing things and make it happen so that His promises will be fulfilled and His plans will come into being. As I mentioned during the first week, that God's ultimate plan is for the redemption of His people. That He will have His people in His promised land with a great direct access to Him. And because of sin, that was severed and never, parang hindi na siya mangyayari. Because God can never tolerate sin. He cannot be seen in the presence of sin. That it seemed like God's promise was not going to happen. In Esther's story, we were in that season wherein they're not in their promised land. They're not in their country. They were all exiled. They're not with their people. And of course, they were not in the presence of God. Or so it seemed. Because the book of Esther does not make any mention, not even once, of the name of God. But as we go through the story, as the story keeps on unfolding before us, as it happens, we will see that even in the apparent absence of God, His hands are at work. We have a God who is behind the scenes. That He is going to bring us to the fulfillment of His promise. The question is this: are you going to be part of that? Do you want to be a party to the fulfillment of God's plan? So chapter 3 ends with Haman and the king drinking to their heart's delight once again. Party. Di ba si King Xerxes mahilig mag-party? 187 days of party. Can you beat that? 187 days of partying. And this has brought to this season, at the end of chapter 3, he's partying again. This time with Haman. And they were now planning on how to be able to make his edict come into reality. Now that there is an impending news that the Jews on the 11th month of, in 30th day of Adar, in the next 11 months, They are seeing a time wherein God's people are going to be wiped out, obliterated from the face of the earth, if Haman's plan is going to happen. And if you're taking down notes, I have entitled this conversation as a defining moment. Esther will now have to jump onto a position of a defining moment. We also go through defining moments of our lives. What course am I going to take up? Which school am I going to go to? Or which country am I going to migrate into? Or who am I going to marry? Or even who are we going to vote? Because this defining moment will determine the next chapters that will happen in the life of Esther. This defining moment in our lives will determine, where am I going to go next? What does the future hold for me? Where is that future going to be? And Esther, as pretty much like we do when we are at our defining moments, will need to make a decision. And this is decision time. Esther will need to decide where to bring the future, her future, and her people's future is now in her very hands. And if there's something that I would like us to take home, I know it's kind of long, but as I unfold it, hopefully you'll still be able to remember and really embrace it and really be able to understand it. It is this, that God appoints particular people. There are certain people in our lives that God gives. Whether yan yung nakakainis mong kamag-anak, nakakairitang kaibigan, there is a reason why they're there. There is a purpose. Is it faith stretching? Is it patience stretching? Or is it a test of your generosity? There is a particular people that God appoints for a particular purpose. There is always a reason why they are there, even if you cannot understand it. By purpose, there is a reason why at a particular time. There are times when we say, God, you're so bagal. Lord, you're not giving me this. I've been praying for this for the past 50 years. And still, sometimes we even help God because we feel that He's so slow. But God's timing is always perfect. There is a particular time for everything. Therefore, I would dare us to be able to understand that at the end of this conversation today, you too will be able to say this with me, that God appoints a particular people to a particular purpose at a particular time. God so designed it that everything that is going to be very particular from this time forward is going to all match and fit into the grand plan that God has for His people. So, if you are with me, turn your Bibles to Esther chapter 4. We are now in chapter 4, and we know where we're coming from. There is an edict that has been announced. It has gone through all of the provinces under the Persian rule, and that edict says, every one of God's people, the Jews, are going to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated at the 11th month of Adar. That is a few months down the road. How do you think the Jews felt? What do you think was going on in their minds? When Mordecai learned of all that has been done, he tore his clothes so wala pa pong social media noon. So there was no text message, there was no call, there was no TV, no radio. So what happens is that on a scroll, a chronicler would be coming into the city square and announce, hear ye, the king now announces that every Jew will be killed, destroyed, and annihilated on the 11th month of Adar. At that moment in time, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth. What are sackcloth? Sa atin po, sako. Okay, for those who are not familiar with it, it's like a woven hemp. It's rope that is not cleaned, that is not polished, that is not smoothened. So imagine how itchy, how uncomfortable, and how heavy it is. And aside from the uncomfortability of wearing sackcloth, they needed to powder themselves, not with baby powder, but ashes. And some say that they do not only powder themselves, but they roll in the ash. Because imagine how they cooked before, diba, with wood. So when they fire that up, there's going to be ashes, and that's where they roll themselves. People in the ancient Near East were very, were very visual and very expressive when they would express their emotions. And also, aside from that, they were wearing clothes appropriate for mourning. They also were wailing. Hindi po siya yung sa mga movies na napapanood natin, ganon, nagsasub-sub sila quietly. No, they would wail and howl. So that was what Mordecai was doing. He was really wailing so loudly that you can feel the pain that he was undergoing. You would understand that he was in a very sorrowful situation. So he went to the city wearing his mourning clothes and crying ever so wildly. But he only reached the king's gate. Why? Because anybody who's pouting or nakasimangot, you remember in the 80s, 90s, there was this picture of a gorilla in the offices, and that said, bawal ang pangit dito. Kasi, or bawal ang nakasimangot pala, bawal ang nakasimangot dito. That's why in the king's court, you are not allowed to be wearing sackcloth and much more wailing wildly, pretty much like what Mordecai was doing. So Mordecai only stayed at the boundary outside of the gate. He was not going to be allowed to go inside. And this was not only Mordecai's expression. In every province where the edict was read, there was great mourning, fasting, and weeping and wailing among the Jews, and many of them in sackcloth and ashes. And they were all wailing so loudly. There was about almost 1 million Jews during that time in Persia. So can you imagine how loud their crying was? So you could just feel the sorrow and the pain that everybody was feeling. Bible scholars were wondering, why is Mordecai in such sorrow? Diba? They were still all alive. Why was Mordecai in such deep sorrow? So they were thinking maybe he was feeling guilty. Because remember, he wasn't bowing to Haman. And the reason why Haman went to this is to avenge that act. That he's not bowing to me. Instead of having Mordecai killed, dinamay niya lahat ng buong Jews. Everybody who is in the tribe of Mordecai is now going to be killed, annihilated, and destroyed. But I would like to think that it was really because he had such deep pain being felt that his people was going to be wiped out of the face of the earth. The 10 tribes of Israel was already gone. And here was a threat that the tribe of Judah and Benjamin was also be gone. And add to that, during that time, when you accuse someone and it's proven that your accusation is true, if that person is killed, or pag nasentensyahan, when he's sentenced and killed, all of his wealth is now going to go to you who accuse them. That's why Haman was so proud to tell the king, I will pay 2/3 of the economic turnaround of the empire. When we kill the Jews, there's nothing going to be lost, because all the plunder coming from the Jews will now be turned over to Haman. So I think more than himself, Mordecai was thinking of his people, that because of his action or inaction, now his people are going to be judged. So, when Esther heard about what Mordecai was doing from his eunuchs and her maidens, he asks them, can you please go and give him some of these clothes? Diba? Ngayon, wala bang care si Esther? She did not even ask why or what's happening. Because maybe in Esther's mind, what's happening to my pinsan? What's happening to... Sino kaya namatay? Because he's in mourning clothes, right? I wonder who among our relatives died. And it seems like Esther is so secluded inside the palace that he was oblivious of anything that was happening outside of the palace gates. It needed his eunuchs and his maidens to be able to announce to him, hey, you know that Mordecai guy? He's there outside of the palace gate and he's crying and he's in mourning clothes. So Esther said, dalhan mo nga. Please send him some of these clothes. Why? Because it's only then that Mordecai will be able to enter the gates if he's already properly dressed. Since he's not allowed to go inside without dressing up properly, Esther needed to offer him proper clothes. Sige na pinsan, pumasok ka na. Please change so that you can come in and maybe they'll be able to discuss even if turuan lang ng nguso or kindata lang. Anyari? Diba? Even if they just signal themselves, just so they'll be able to understand. And Esther will be able to understand what's happening to you. Why are you in mourning clothes? Who died? But Mordecai would not hear of it. He did not accept the clothes. Why? Because he was in mourning. He wants to tell Esther, no, I'm not going to change until these things are settled. I am in mourning. I am in pain. So he sends back the clothes that Esther sent to him. And after that, Esther summoned her PA. Diba? Yung kanyang right-hand man. Because there were certain eunuchs that were given to the queens to be able to give them whatever they needed. And he told Hatak, can you please go to that man at the gate and ask him what's wrong? Ask him what's troubling him and why. So Hatak went to Mordecai in the palace gate. And Mordecai told him everything. Okay? Mordecai did 3 things. 1, he reported the exact amount of Haman's promise to the king. Why did Mordecai need to go to such details? So that Esther will know that this is not hearsay. This is true. Because if you give so much detail, then you know it's true. It's not going to change. So he tells the story of what's going to happen, and he tells about the amount of the bribe, apparent bribe, and he gave him a copy of the edict that was read. Why? Why do you think he gave a copy? So that Esther will be able to understand. Because like if you're sending messages, we all know that either may dagdag bawas yan, diba? Minsan gumaganda pa yung kwento, hindi mo naman sinabi, nasabi na. So to be able to really prove the veracity of the message, Mordecai gives a copy of the edict that was read for Esther to be able to discern and decipher for herself. And add to those stories, he gave an instruction. So 3 things he gave plus an instruction. And what was the instruction? Go into the king's presence and beg for mercy. You're not just going to talk. You're not just going to tell the story, but you're going to beg. Makikiusap ka. When you beg, you are not going to accept no for an answer. You're really going to beg to the point that they're going to give you something. And you're not only going to beg for mercy, but you're going to plead. Makikiusap ka. You will now want to touch his heart. When you're pleading, it's the emotion that you touch. So he's saying to Esther, you go to the king, your husband, see him and beg for mercy and plead with me. He's not saying, Esther, you plead for me so that I will be saved. Mordecai was not selfish. He was not doing this only for himself, but he was doing this for his people. And he said, plead with me. And read what's next. For your people. speaking to Esther. Wait a minute. You remember in chapter 1, when Esther was given clear instructions that he's not going to reveal who she was, not her nationality, not her lineage, not her people. But here, Mordecai is now asking her, you have to reveal who you are. You have to plead for your people. You need to beg for your people. Why? Because that is the only way that this edict will be reversed or turned around. If you stand and say that you are one of us, we might have a fighting chance that this edict will not come into being. Very, very different from what Esther was instructed initially to do. Right? This time, Esther, you have to reveal who you are. So Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said and gave her what Mordecai instructed. So Esther asked Hathach to go back. Simply said, she's just wanting to say, I cannot do it. Mordecai would ask, bakit? Why can't she do it? It's because there is a law. There is a protocol in the kingdom. You cannot just barge in and go see the king. It's not like today, even if husband mo pa yan. Now, you can go to Tita LA, can you please tell Pastor Martin? Diba? Kasi you can say, you can approach the wife to be able to go to the husband and the wife will be able to talk to the husband. It was not so during that time. Remember that you needed to be summoned to the palace, to the presence of the king, before you are going to accept and receive an audience with him. There was proper protocol that was being done. And it said that with this one law, if you go into the presence of the king without him summoning you, what happens? Off with his head. That's why, if you'll notice the paintings and the sculptures of kings of old, their scepter plays a major prominence there, right? Because that determines the life and death of anyone who comes to the presence of the king. Contrary to Vashti, who was summoned and did not like to come into the king's presence, that's why he was banished. And here, Esther was saying to Mordecai, I cannot just barge in unless he extends his gold scepter to me. Otherwise, that would mean I'll be dead, even dying before that edict comes into being. And add to that, Kuya, the king has not summoned me for the past 30 days. There seems like there's trouble in homeland as far as Esther and the king are concerned. And that doesn't help any if I just barge into the court. So Esther was telling Mordecai, hindi po talaga pwede. I cannot do it. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer, very powerful, and I hope we'll be able to understand it clearly. Do not think, he goes, that because you are in the king's house, you alone, of all the Jews around, will escape. Is Mordecai threatening Esther? What Mordecai is saying is that if all the Jews will be wiped out as per Haman's edict, what makes you think that you'll be able to escape? What makes you think that you'll be able to survive? One way or the other, you will be revealed. Because remember, during this time, Esther was a secret Jew. If Haman's edict is going to happen, if it's going to transpire, it will come out one way or the other. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Akala mo ba, Esther, ikaw lang, if you do not do this, do you think God's plan will not happen? Obviously, Mordecai knew that there is a God and that God had a plan for the Jewish people. He knew that if Esther did not want to stand for this challenge, for this opportunity to be able to take part into that plan, deliverance and relief will come from elsewhere. Even if you don't stand for it, even if you do not accept this challenge, God will bring relief and deliverance. Why? Because that is His people. He has a promise. He has a covenant with them. And comes to mind that Exodus story. I'm sure Mordecai knew that. He knew that deliverance would come from the weirdest and the unfathomable scenarios. God would always deliver His people. Exodus story, the Red Sea in front of them, mountains surrounding them, the Egyptian army after them. There was nowhere else to go. They knew the Egyptians were going to catch them and bring them back to Egypt and bring them back to slavery. But what did God do? Unknown deliverance, relief from somewhere, the Red Sea parts. Who would ever think that that was at all possible? No one. Not even in their wildest dream did relief and deliverance from the parting of the Red Sea would come to them. We all know of a lot of stories where deliverance just came. Who would ever think that Joshua would be able to defeat his opponents at the time when what did he do? Nothing. He just marched. Right? Gideon, with just a handful of people in his army, would win without even fighting. People who were sick suddenly gets healed. You were not supposed to be promoted, but all of a sudden you are. You're not supposed to get a bonus through the pandemic, but here you are receiving so much ting, ting, ting in your bank account. There is relief and deliverance that will come from God for His people, even if you don't stand for it. That's what Mordecai is saying. Okay, Esther, if you are not going to accept this challenge, God will give relief and deliverance for His people from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. Is Mordecai cursing Esther? No. In Mordecai's love for Esther, he was just explaining, Esther, you have to do this. You have to be part of this plan. Because if God delivers the Jews and there's no one else to save you, what's going to happen to you? You're going to be stuck there inside the palace and life will not be the same. Even bringing you to the point that you will perish. This is something that is very beautiful. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position, to your promotion for such a time as this. Mordecai knew Esther's story. He knew the rite of passage that Esther went through just to be able to get into the position of being queen. 187 days of partying. The king just wanted to solicit help for a war against the Greeks. 187 days of partying needed to happen, and when Queen Vashti was summoned, she did not come. She should have come. Any queen would come and follow the king's word, but she didn't. And because of that, there was a beauty pageant that was held, and Esther came into being. That was the reason why this group of people, of Israelites, were in Persia during that time, because a Persian queen needed to be raised in the person of Esther, who should not have been a queen. She was a commoner, a peasant girl. But because she was lovely and beautiful, as the author explained, she gained favor upon favor with people that she met, thus rising her to the royal position that she now held. And is that the only reason why? No, it's because God has a perfect plan. It is for such a time as this. This is the moment now, Esther, that you have to accept the role that is being given to you by God. Why? Because God appoints particular people for a particular purpose at a particular time. God's timing is never late. He will always come on time. You remember that story of a pastor's son who only got saved after 54 years of the father's prayer? Was that God being delayed? No, it was a perfect time. Mordecai was telling Esther, Esther, this is your time. This is God's appointed time for you. You are that particular people. But God, in His gentlemanly, wonderful, kind, mild-mannered way, will not force Himself through. He's not going to point a gun at you and tell you, you have to obey, you have to follow, you have to do this. No. At the end of the day, we still have that chance. Are you going to say yes? Are you going to come on board to be part of that great purpose that God has? And this was Esther's time. Because each one of us has a role to play in the ongoing plan of God. Until that reaches into fruition, until all of us are heavenward or already in heaven, that's the only time our role will end. But for now, while we're here, this is the appointed time. Some of us may be thinking, saan kaya akong country pupunta to be able to serve God? What ministry kaya ako pupunta to be able to serve God? What school am I going to go to? What course am I going to take? Where am I going to move to be of value to God? No. You are there right now for a purpose. This is the appointed time. And find out what's the purpose God has for you. And the question is, are you on board? Will you take on the challenge that God has for you to take part in that great plan that He has? The plan is so huge and so great that He wants every little piece of us to be able to contribute to the fulfillment and the happening of that plan. Look at what Martin Luther King said. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poems. He should sweep streets so well that the hosts of heaven and earth will pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. Are you a student? Tita Barry, I'm just a student. I can't do anything. There's one young man who's eating alone. What can you do? There's a little girl who's being bullied. Hair being pulled, being tripped. What can you do? Tita Barry, I'm just a quiet employee in the corner. I just do photocopying. Photocopy your heart out and do it well. Sa bahay lang po ako, nagwawalis, nagdidilig. Do your work well so that the host of heaven and earth will proclaim, well done, good and faithful servant. Whatever God is calling us to do, no matter how small, minsan tayo yung nagde-define nun eh. We are defining how little our contribution will be. But in God's kingdom, if you are going to do it well, a pat on the shoulder, an embrace, a hug, a pat on the head, a commendation will be given to you. Well done, good and faithful servant. Are we there? Are we answering for that call? Allow God to use you where He finds you. Meet God where you are. God uses you for a purpose at a specific time. And my prayer is that the time will be now. That we will say yes to God's call. It does not have to be, as Martin Luther King is saying, it does not have to be in full-time ministry. It does not even have to be in ministry. Wherever you are, be the best father, be the best mother, be the best wife, be the best girlfriend or boyfriend, be the best student, be the best worker. Be the best wherever you are because you know that God is calling you to do just that. And then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, gathering all her strength, gathering all her courage. Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for me. I'm not going to do this alone. You come with me. Remember our series on Galatians? We are now one family. Mordecai, our family will gather together. Let's all pray together. Let's pray for that this thing is going to happen. Fast for me. Do not eat for 3 days, night or day, and my maids and I will do the same. Esther is now acknowledging, yes, I am one of you and I am going to stand for that. Remember, Esther had a dual personality as far as the court is concerned. She was Hadassah, that Persian, sweet, mild-mannered, very nice girl. At the same time, she was Esther, the Persian queen, who was doing all of the things that every Persian would do. Are we the same? Are we secret agent Christians? That we're Christians on weekends and pagans on weekdays? Ouch, di ba? Aray. But is that what we're doing? Are we living our life in prayer at night for the sins that we committed in the day, only to wake up the following day and do the same? Esther now stands for what is true and what is right. I am one of God's people, and together with you, let's do this. I will embrace God's call, and for the next 3 days after this fasting, I will go into the king's court, even if it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther was embracing the chance, the possibility that she might be killed. More than 500 years down the road, there's one even greater deliverer. That one great deliverer embraced his death. He knew he was going to die, and yet he said, "Not my will, Lord, but yours be done." In the Garden of Gethsemane, he submitted to the fact that I will die, Lord, but I will accept that to be able to deliver your people from sin unto salvation. That is who Jesus is to us. Esther is a flawed deliverer, but she still stood for that chance to assist and help into the deliverance of his people. Jesus embraced death so that we may live. He perished so that he may be able to give us life. And that, my dear friends, is how the story of Esther unfolded. From that Jewish peasant girl, oblivious of what was happening around, just obedient to whatever Mordecai was saying, she now is able to gather all of the strength and courage that she has and says, I will go to the king's court, even if I perish. And look at the reversals. Mordecai, the one who used to tell Esther what's going to happen. This is what you do. You're going to go to the king. You're going to go to the court. You're going to see him. Do not say who you are. Everything that Esther did was upon the teaching and coaching of Mordecai. This time, Mordecai turns around and obeys his queen. Right? Ang galing, di ba? Now Mordecai goes and carries out everything that Esther says. It's now Mordecai who is obeying his queen. And Mordecai says, I will deliver your message and will follow what your instructions are. Mga kapatid, God appoints particular people for a particular purpose at God's particular time. And it is my prayer that we too, with strength and courage, will be able to respond to be part in fulfilling God's plan. Be part. Joshua was told by God, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. And that strength and courage doesn't come from anywhere else, but by the prodding of God through the Holy Spirit who is in you. The Holy Spirit is there to nudge us, to prod us, to teach us even where to go. With strength and courage, Esther went onto the plate to be able to bat and be able to carry the home run out of the Jews' annihilation and destruction. And as we think for ourselves, okay, Lord, how can I be part in fulfilling God's plan? A few questions that you might want to think and ponder upon. What has God made me to be able to serve His purpose? Who are you now? Think back 3, 4, 5 years ago, even 10, 20 years. Who were you then and who are you now? What is that molding that God is doing to you to be that particular person? What is the purpose God has brought me here in this place for this moment? Who among you thought 10 years, 20 years ago that you're going to be in Singapore? Bakit tayo nandito? Sana nandun tayo sa Maynila, nakikisama tayo sa rally. O nakikicheer sa UP win. Diba? After 36 years, why are we here? Why am I here? Find out, what is the purpose God brought you here now? Did you ever think that you're going to be in Singapore, staying here, working here? Hindi. Sa ng buhay sa Pilipinas, only in the Philippines, di ba? It's always so happy then and happy now. What are the unique opportunities I have in the web of relationships that I have? Look at your social media. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Diba? Whatever social media platforms you have, how many friends and followers do you have there? Are you just called to be there for your selfies? For them to see what food you're eating? Is that all? How beautiful the surroundings are? Ang ganda-ganda ko, ang ganda ng makeup ko, ang ganda ng lipstick ko, bago yung damit ko. Is that all? Find out in the web of your relationships, what are the unique opportunities God is giving me there? And how has my path of serving His purpose been paved the way by God? Esther was not supposed to be queen, but God designed it that way. We are placed by God here for a purpose at this particular time. May we be able to take part in the great plan God has for us. Even if you don't say yes yet, God is already making the way for you to be part, because God knows how joyful that experience is going to be. And it is my prayer that we too will be able to stand as Esther said, if I perish, all for the glory of God.